Shalom and welcome to the Heartland Connection. This is Zach Waller, the Executive Director of Yovel, your host, coming to you guys straight from the Heartland of Israel. So it is Passover season, Pesach, as they say in Hebrew. It's the season of our freedom. And such a amazing season to be in, coming to this first part of the new year, the month of Aviv, and this year is actually really special for us. For me and my family, we're actually in the land of Israel and going to be celebrating in Jerusalem. A friend of ours has invited us to come and celebrate Passover, the Seder, in the Holy City. And so we're very, very much looking forward to that and celebrating the feast in Jerusalem. So every year at the end of the Haggadah, at the end of the Seder, we say next year in Jerusalem. So this year we're actually able to be right here in the Holy City. And it's just really an amazing time to be alive where this is actually possible. It's actually doable to come and celebrate the feast in the land of Israel, in the Holy City. So we're very much looking forward to that, and hopefully next podcast I'll be able to update you guys on how that went. In the States, the rest of the staff team is working on getting ready for Family Week. We've got a bunch of people registered and coming in soon to our camp there in Missouri, and very much looking forward to that time there together. I think every year just getting together with so many people. And with like-minded believers that are wanting to celebrate the feast and want to press into God and find out more who He is, who we are as His children. It's just an incredible thing. So staff team's there getting ready for that and to host everyone. So this week's Torah portion, we actually have a special portion, the Passover readings. And they will start on Friday, actually. We have the fast of the firstborn. And the readings there, Exodus 32, 11 through verse 14, and then Exodus 34, 1 through 10. And then on Shabbat, which this year is very special, Shabbat is also the first day of Passover. We read from Exodus 12, 21 through verse 51, and then Numbers 28, 16 through 25, and Joshua chapter 5, verse 2 through chapter 6, verse 1 is the Haftorah. And then next week it gets a little tricky. I remember this happened a couple years ago when Passover fell on Friday night. The tricky part is that outside of the land of Israel, the Jewish people celebrate 2 days of the Yom Tov, 2 days of what you might call the High Sabbath. I think that's the way it's translated in the King James Version. So this year, the Yom Tov falls on Friday, since Passover starts Friday night, and then the seventh day of the feast, which is always confusing because, Sukkot, you have the 8th day, or Passover, you have the 7th day. That's the High Sabbath, the Yom Tov. And so it's always confusing. Okay, which day is and so for some reason I always think it's the 8th day. Then I go, oh, no, yeah, it's the 7th. And so since that Yom Tov falls on Friday, and that one day is celebrated in Israel, Jews in Israel will move on to the next Torah portion, which is Parashat Shmini, on Shabbat, okay? But since Jews in the U.S. are celebrating 2 days of the High Sabbath, the Yom Tov, which would include Friday and Shabbat, the Jews outside of Israel will read the Passover portion on Shabbat, April 7th, and they won't start the next Torah portion, Parashat Shmini, until the following Shabbat, April 14th. So basically, Israel is jumping one portion ahead of the diaspora readings until Shavuot, I believe, is when the U.S. and the diaspora will do a double portion and catch back up to what was being read in Israel. So just a little heads up on that little change. It could be very confusing. Hopefully I didn't confuse you more, but that's the basic reason for that. So Passover's coming up, and I wanted to dig in a little bit to matzah and chametz, right? This unleavened bread and this leavening yeast. what's this all about? I was very interested, and I thought a teaching by Rabbi David Foreman and Imu Shalev on Aleph Beta was really interesting, and it just asked the question. This one huge thing I've learned from the Jewish people is ask all the questions, and the basic questions, the fundamentals of anything, and it's amazing where you'll get. But they just ask some basic questions. What's the deal with this matzah, right? Does it just represent that we came out of Egypt quickly, the dough didn't rise, and so we eat matzah to remember when we came out, or is there more to it than that? How come for Passover we eat matzah? There's this commandment to eat matzah and get rid of the leaven, right? This is kind of two different things. You're commanded to eat matzah, and you're commanded to get rid of the leaven. During Sukkot, we build the sukkah, but we don't tear down our house, right? Even during Passover Seder, we eat maror, the bitter herbs, but we don't get rid of all of our sweet vegetables, right? So matzah is a little bit different, right? We're eating matzah, and we're totally getting rid of, and like meticulously getting rid of all of the chametz, all of the leavening. It's also interesting that matzah is actually mentioned before coming out of Egypt, right? The matzah with the Passover lamb before. So it's actually has to be more than just talking about the running out quickly, because it was actually mentioned before they even left. And it's such a big deal that this festival could be looked at as like all about leaven, right? It's like this whole thing about not having leaven. It's such a key important thing in order so that you can have matzah, and so there's got to be something to this. There's got to be more to it. There's got to be something really deep and powerful, and that's what I want to dig in today. One thing that's interesting is that matzah is actually mentioned outside of the context of Passover. It was used in the service in the tabernacle and the temple. So maybe this can give us some hints on what exactly is going on here. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 18, it says, "You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, or let the fat of my feast remain until the morning." And so we see here that none of the blood sacrifices are to be offered with leaven. So all of these meal offerings, flour offerings, are supposed to be given unleavened, right? So we see that this is outside of just Passover context. Matzah was used in the tabernacle and the temple for the temple and tabernacle service. The next verse says, "The best of the first fruits of your ground you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God." And the verse finishes off, "You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk." So at first, these seem extremely random verses here. It's like, okay, what in the world does not offering sacrifices with leaven, bringing first fruits, and not eating meat and milk together have anything to do with each other? Like, what's the order here? But if we take a little closer look in here, and this is what the Rabbi David Foreman and Imu Shalev from Aleph Beta pointed out, is that the Bikurim, the first fruits in verse 19, is... and we actually, there's also a tie into this with Passover, because in the Haggadah, right, during the Seder, we actually talk about the Bikurim speech, right, the speech that the Israelite would give as he comes to the temple, is that my father was an Aramean, and go through the whole thing. So this actually comes up in the Haggadah. So there's another Passover connection here. But the whole speech, the whole thing is about recognizing God as the creator, right, that we are... little creator, God is the big creator, right? God created the whole world, and then we take the world and we also create things and do things as a farmer. We're taking the soil that God created, the seeds that God created, the produce that God created, and then we're replanting, and we're like joining in God with the creation. So during the first fruits, we're going in and saying, God, you are the one who made this happen. Even though I worked hard and did it, I recognize you are the source. You are the person who created this. Okay, so that's 19. And you could even say that the milk and meat thing, don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk, could also be a sort of pointing back to the recognizing the source, right? Because you have the mother that's giving milk, and then it's saying not to boil the young goat. So there's some sort of pointing back to the source here, pointing back to where something came from, and recognizing the creator, right? And so if we look at these two things, we recognize that there's this common deal of recognizing source. So if we go back to the first part, in verse 18, it says, talks about not offering with leaven. So maybe there's something pointing here to the fact that we're trying to get back to the source. We're trying to recognize God. So let's dig into that a little bit. From what I understand, it's a really interesting fact that most people back in biblical times, according to one theory, is that everybody ate matzah, but the Egyptians actually created chametz. The Egyptians actually created leaven. They were, very developed at that point or whatever in their culture, and so they actually are the ones who came up with this process of leavening. It was kind of a different deal back then from what I understand. It was like naturally gathered in the dough, or like it was a little bit different than, getting our packets at Walmart or whatever. But that the Egyptians kind of developed the concept more. And so basically you could say that the Egyptians, the priests, actually are the ones who came up with this idea of making bread rise and creating this dough, and it was actually a huge, major, technological innovation at that time, and that Egypt was the bread makers, which kind of makes sense because we see the Israelites building these huge storehouses for grain, right? So if grain and bread and that stuff was a big deal in Egypt, it makes sense that the Israelites would be building these in order to store these places up, and then the whole story we have with Joseph and all these things points back to wheat and that sort of thing. So what they pointed out in the teaching was that God doesn't have a problem with us eating chametz, right? He doesn't necessarily say that we can't eat chametz all the rest of the year, right? So chametz isn't necessarily a sin. It's not like you eat the leaven and you've sinned. He doesn't have a problem with us being farmers, right? Digging into the soil and making things happen. But once a year, we need to go back and recognize him, right? We're saying, even though man was able to create bread, right? Was able to plant wheat, to weed it and tend it and water it and then watch it grow and then harvest it and then grind the wheat kernels, do the winnowing and grind the wheat kernels, make it into flour and then make it into bread, and then have that source. But we at that point need to recognize, even though I worked really hard in getting it from the ground to the bread, I need to recognize that God is the source. And so in that way, it goes back and relates to those other two things from the scripture. So this whole idea about the matzah is eating matzah to recognize God, to recognize the simple faith in God, to recognize God as who he is and kind of put us in our places, us as humans and God as God. And Rabbi Melamed actually had quite a few things to say about this sort of thing. I don't know if you guys know this, but his work is actually available online. If you look up Pnei Halacha, Rabbi Melamed, you'll find it, and he has a lot of things translated into English actually online, but I was really interested to go in and read what he had put out. He actually has several books written about different aspects of Judaism and biblical things that are really, really interesting and help understand what's going on here. So Rav Melamed points out that there's two different names for this feast. One is Chag HaPesach, right, the feast of the passing over, right? The death angel passed over. And then there's Chag HaMatzot. So this feast is actually called the Feast of Matzah, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? So it just shows you how important this thing is. There's something here that we really need to get. And it's really special that the matzah, that there's a lot of things and services in the temple, and there's like different things that you're commanded to eat. There's this first fruits, there's this, the offerings that were made in the tabernacle. But the matzah is actually the only thing in today's time that's like sanctified food that was like commanded by God to eat. It's one of the only things that we can actually do in our time and today without the temple. So it's a very, very special thing to actually eat of the matzah, something that God commanded to be done. So this is very, very special. The only sanctified food we can say God commanded us to eat this and then partake of it. So matzah is a very special deal. So Rav Melamed says, At the Exodus from Egypt, God's sovereignty over the world was given its most apparent and concrete manifestation. Thus, our faith in God is fundamentally rooted in the Exodus. The matzah symbolizes this aspect of our holiday, as we read in the Haggadah. This matzah that we eat, what is the reason? Because our forefathers' dough did not have time to rise before the Holy Supreme King of Kings revealed himself to them and redeemed them. So, the Jewish people really see this eating of matzah as the representation of God redeeming them and God's sovereignty over the world, right? It's not just about the Jewish people getting freed from Egypt to go and serve God. It's about God showing the world that He is sovereign and that He is the King of Kings, right? And so the matzah is symbolizing this. And it's important to see that Israel is the opposite of Egypt, right? They are diametrically opposed. They're not just. It wasn't just about one kingdom enslaved the other, and then God set the one free. Egypt, in every way, was totally anti what Israel should be all about. Egypt was totally into materialism, and this world is what mattered. There was no thought of what would happen. Or of something afterwards mattering. It was like this world is what was important, and we see this by their embalming practices, right? They're like hanging on to physical things as long as possible and glorifying the flesh, right, the body, and the pyramids, right? These giant, cemetery thing, that's like just glorifying somebody's body. It's like who this person was in the flesh, physically was. And so Rabbi Malamed in his article points out how this mindset of everything being so physical and like focusing on the physical stuff leads to immorality. If you don't have any thought about a God above who's watching you or living for with purpose and serving a God above, then why not indulge in this world's pleasures? Why not commit these different immoralities? Rabbi Lamed says, since we have not finished liberating ourselves from the bonds of this material world, the chains of the evil impulse and its lusts, from a spiritual perspective, we still need to continue leaving Egypt, right? We're still in this process of leaving Egypt, and studying into this mitzvah, studying into this the book of Exodus in order to fulfill this mitzvah of eating matzah and learning about liberation and the freedom that God gave from Egypt. So Rabbi Malamed goes on to say that what does chametz represent? And he said that it represents pride, which I think is a very common understanding of chametz, of the leaven. It's like puffing up, right? It's pride. But he goes on to say that there are two types of pride. That one is that man exaggerates his own praiseworthiness and thinks he's wiser, stronger, and better than he really is, right? This kind of ego that rises up in him. He did something good, and he's like, oh yeah, I did that. It was all about me. He's exaggerating who he is. He thinks he's better than anyone or whatever. The second type of pride, he says, which corresponds to chametz on Pesach, is man's pride toward his creator, his God. Jewish faith is predicated on the acknowledgement that God created the world and determined its destiny, and that the roots of all things depend on him alone. Therefore, on Pesach, the holiday geared towards imparting the fundamentals of faith, we are commanded to be extremely cautious and to avoid eating and possessing even a smidgen of chametz, which symbolizes our human aspects that must not get mixed in when we speak about the roots and foundations of faith. During the rest of the year, however, when we are involved with developing and improving the branches, chametz is allowed and even desirable. Matzah, symbolizing our recognition that the spiritual roots of things are beyond our grasp, even though God granted us the ability to operate within and improve the world, is the opposite of chametz. Therefore, on Pesach, when we are engaged with the most fundamental elements of faith, we do not mix even one iota of chametz in our food. We eat only matzah, which remains simple and thin throughout its baking without going through any additional process of swelling. So basically what I'm getting from Rabbi Malamed is that the chametz here is specifically talking about arrogance towards God, right? Being prideful, lifting yourself up above God. So as a farmer, for instance, You may feel like, hey, God made dirt and plants, but look what I've done. I've made, a beautiful farm and grow amazing produce and grind my wheat into flour and add yeast and make beautiful bread. Wow, look at me. I've done even better than God. Instead of recognizing that without God, we would have had nothing to start with, right? So the matzah helps us get back to be thankful for and recognize the source that is God, right? I think this concept is really important because many Christians hear the word pride and immediately think of arrogance or, a holier than thou attitude, like a negative thing. In an effort to get away from this pride, we see Christians throughout history torturing themselves and not enjoying anything physically pleasurable. And I think, even though their motive might have been commendable, I think that this idea is a little bit off base, or maybe a lot off base. Something I've learned from the Jewish people here in Israel is that God actually wants us to live in this world, right? He actually wants us to, take part in what's happening here. And he created a perfect setup for us as humans to live in peace and joy and blessing. And going back to the whole matzah analogy, God doesn't forbid us, I mentioned this earlier, from eating leaven year-round. He actually wants us to take initiative, to better this world, to have an element of pride, so to speak, or like self-confidence, knowing that God has put us in this earth, on this world, for a reason. We don't need to try to escape it, to try to get rid of it, to try to punish ourselves, to not enjoy it. We need to embrace it and find our God-given purpose in it, like as being a part of it, right? And also make sure we steer away from, false humility. There's this idea that, if we have this kind of a fear of arrogance, right? It's like we're preoccupying ourselves with we're preoccupied with ourselves, reflecting on a lack of trust in the Almighty. It's like we're not focusing in on God as our Creator, and true humility, acknowledging our shortcomings and arrogance to do the best that we can. And just give ourselves totally over to God. And, that's true humility, when we recognize that, we are who we are, and God is able to have mercy on us and allow us to do great and awesome things. That humility isn't talking about how bad I am or how I'm not good at something, or how, that's like you're actually still trying to, prove yourself that you are humble, right? And so when you're trying to prove yourself and the focus is on you, then that's false humility. When the focus is on God, and acknowledging that He is so much greater than us, and through Him we are actually able to accomplish much. There's this true humility comes in. There's so much more I could go into about that, but I think it's very important for us to recognize this sort of this place where Christianity has gotten off track and has tried to say that, by laying on a bed of nails or, these crazy things, torturous things that have been done, that those were actually, that God liked that, or that was good for us, that we don't need to torture ourselves in order to please God. We have to live in this world. That God wants us to, and it actually commands us in the Bible to go and settle the land, right? To go and, to be a part of the physical things. We see the Jewish people coming in today's time, settling the land of Israel, right, as they were commanded, and God's blessing being fulfilled in that. So there is a physical, enjoyment of living in this world, of being married, having children, living in this world the way that God designed it. It doesn't work if we don't live according to the way He designed it, but it does work very well and beautifully and amazing if we follow God's will, if we follow His instruction. And I think that's what we need to look at as we're getting rid of our leaven, we're getting rid of our sin and our places in our life where we're putting ourselves or anything else above God, but also not losing our self-confidence, our belief that we are God's children and that we can do great and mighty things with His strength. So as we celebrate Passover this year, may we recognize who God is, and may He show us who He is, and may we go forth from here to accomplish His will with strong confidence, not allowing our pride to get in the way. Thanks for listening, and Shabbat Shalom from the beautiful, exceedingly good land of Israel.
Restoration.